for the wireless web, and the project crashed and burned. But I realized afterwards there was a key missing component, which was voice and messaging. So after I left Sprint, I became an independent consultant, and I've had this interest in this area for a very long time, and I've written about it and blogged about it and lectured about it. In the meantime, I was chief analyst at Telco 2.0, which I co-founded, and I wrote a report on the future of voice and messaging. I've also been strategy director at British Telecom's IT and network division. And I now, for the last 3 years, have been running my own independent consultancy on the future of telecom and doing all kinds of innovation services. I run future voice and telco OTT services workshops, public ones, with next one's coming up in London in 2 weeks' time. So it's something I'm actively involved with about the future of this area.
So in short, Martin, you haven't actually done much with your life.
Never.
Okay, so thank you for the background. By the way, there's some slides that I'm going to be showing, hopefully in sync with Martin, or at least to complement what he's got to say. But before that happens, I need to tell you where that is, and theoretically you should be able to see that at vuc.me/live. Otherwise, go to the Plus Real-Time page on Google+, or try to find it on YouTube. If I keep talking, it'll go on and on. So let's give the floor to Martin and find it. Get good with Google and find it on YouTube. Go ahead, Martin.
Okay, so the slides are actually up on SlideShare. If you Google, it should be in the first screen of results. So, right, so some background to this presentation. So this presentation I gave a week ago at the customer forum of Metaswitch Networks, and this is not endorsed by Metaswitch, this is all my ideas, but the origin of this presentation is some work I was doing for a company called Harken, H-A-R-Q-E-N, and they produced a very clever piece of software which is kind of like a next generation of webinars and conference calling. But we're struggling to find a way of explaining it to the world. So they hired me to write a white paper to explain the nature of this interesting area that they were entering into. I looked at the product they produced. I thought, this is clever. Yeah, it's a very clever product. And I started writing about all the ways in which it might be clever. And it took a while for the penny to drop, and it's when somebody said, we link what people say to link, hyperlinks. What they've built is the world's first Hypervoice browser. And when I went away and thought of more and more about this problem domain, I saw an emerging story of how there's more to putting voice in the web than web voice. That there was a need to make voice into a full first-class tier 1 hypermedium, and to fully participate in the web. That required to think about how the web amplifies ideas and how voice has a life beyond ephemeral words being spoken in the moment. So going quickly through this presentation. It's quite a long presentation. That's one we can trot through, or can gallop through, and it's a little bit about the history of voice, and it leads us up to that point of insight and saying, right, this is the way forward, and what might some of the consequences of that be. So I could kick into this. So I think it's slide 3. So the structure of the presentation is talk a little about the past. How voice has evolved, a bit about what might happen in the future, and then at the very end return back to the now, and the now is very much about the so what for telcos, who are the original audience for this presentation. On slide 4, and throughout the presentation there's golden thread, which is that there's a collision between two worlds and two mindsets and two value systems, which is telco and the web. And much as each side likes to use soothing words like convergence, that the collision of these two will change both of them. It will change the web as much as it changes telco. So I'm going to talk about how some of that confusion arises and what might emerge. And one of the reasons it's confusing is that there's a dissonance, particularly for telcos, between the beliefs and behaviors and values that made them successful and the current reality that they experience. And that reality is not of convergence and it's IMS and RCS and the like. That's not what's being successful. What's being successful is fragmentation and embedding all kinds of new communication capabilities, including voice, into a myriad of new services and new ways of communicating. And we're right in the heart of that change. So if you think of how text used to be, once upon a time there was the papyrus. And there was one way of doing text. And then we had the printing press, and then we had magazines, and there were more and more press text media that got invented. Then the internet comes along, and the internet is a kind of meta-medium, and that accelerated the process of generating new text-based media. And the same thing is going to happen to voice. So, on slide 8, there are three big changes I see. Well, I'm proposing there are 3 big changes, hypothesizing that will happen in order to reconcile with the underlying reality of how voice works and how it works with the web and as a hypermedium. And those 3 are that there's a change in user experience, a change in the business model, and a change in network technology. But the main focus really about Hypervoice is on the user experience. The other 2 are corollaries of the kind of world we're entering into. So, let's start off with the story of telcos. Because voice is telephony is the original and best voice service. So it helps to go back to the fundamentals as to what this voice thing actually is, and remind ourselves, because it's very easy to get confused between voice and telephony. And there's a trivial and profound point, which is that that speaking, talking through voice via our machines is trying to replicate the experience, or historically trying to replicate the experience that we have when we're speaking together. So as if we're in the same room, we might call it proxy phone, and then when we move too far apart to hear each other directly, it's telephone. So it's always approaching from the underside the experience of being in the same room together. And the interesting thing about Hypervoice is it can be better than being together. Now there are actually some aspects of telephony that subtly are better than being together. So some of the research about people's ability to detect whether people are lying, the degree of truthfulness and trust that exists, the level of how revealing people are of their inner thoughts and feelings, and how the intimacy that conversations generate on a telephone call than if you're in the same room. And therefore, telephone calls actually work better for some things like human resources processes than being in the same room. So there's already elements of telephony having a almost bionic sense about what it does to us. There's a little joke I put into the presentation for those who are there was it's very easy to take for granted this speaking as shouldn't, because it's somewhat of a marvel. So don't say you work for a phone company, because that's boring. And certainly don't say you work for a network equipment vendor, because that's really not cool. Because what you really do is you're an illusionist. Is you're conjuring up the whisper of someone hundreds of miles away into your ear. And that illusion has a name, so slide 18. It's called cognitive absorption. And in the picture in the slide, there's a guy who's clearly not paying attention to the phone call and therefore not falling for the trick. He's just rubbing his ear with a piece of plastic. So the key thing that's been valued for a very, very, very long time in voice has been creating that illusion of cognitive absorption. That's where all the focus has historically been, and that's the thing that I'm suggesting Hypervoice can help to transcend. There's a picture from a museum of You May Telephone From Here, which is that we've become accustomed to voice being associated with all the patterns of telephony, and for decades and decades. You know, it's 100 years this year since the first automated telephone call. And when phone calls were new, a whole set of new patterns emerged. So a picture from 1917 from the Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company saying, "Concentrate whilst telephoning." And the phone companies had to teach us how to adapt our previous behaviors to this new technology. So, for example, Alexander Graham Bell thought people should go "ahoy, ahoy" to summon people at the other end of a phone call. The existing customs and protocols of human speaking had to be adapted. And as a snippet from that same advert is, it's almost impossible to carry on a satisfactory telephone conversation with a man who talks with a cigar in the corner of his mouth, holds his telephone at an awkward angle, and has his attention on something other than what you're saying. So it's, you can see how the mores and etiquette of the time had to be adapted. And so phone calls have, over the years, accumulated an inner structure. It's a little bit like a chess game. There are various standard opening gambits that people use. And then there's a middle game and there's sort of standard end games that get deployed. And these customs and protocols didn't exist prior to people speaking at a distance. So, for example, the lengths of pauses people use on phone calls are different to how they speak when they're proximate to each other. They have a different meaning. And I found on what is it people actually do on phone calls. And it's from 1992, called Telephone Conversation, where a historian and sociologist called Robert Hopper. And he notes a phenomenon called the hegemony of the caller, which is intrinsic to how telephony works. And that the caller has this absolute dominance over the callee. The caller chooses the timing of the call, and they also choose at the moment of opening of the call the topic. So there's a natural imbalance, a lack of reciprocity that is embedded into telephony, which may be one of the reasons why younger generations are rejecting it. It's not because necessarily they aren't into talking at all, but the nature of the product is unsuited to the way in which they wish to speak. And all of that grew up in a very different era with a completely different context economically, socially, politically, technically. So the Bell system, for example, brought that together. A good example of how that happens and the assumptions that are wired in that we don't necessarily question is something like the toll-free number. So that was introduced by AT&T Long Distance. They invented it. And on slide 26, it implicitly assumes that our time is cheap and phone calls are expensive, which if you're the phone company is surely what you definitely want. And historically, it was more expensive to make a minute of distance telephone call than it was to hire a minute of labor. And that flipped over between about 1982 and 2000. So 1982 was the last year in which it was more expensive to make a minute of long-distance phone call than it was to hire a college graduate. And by year 2000, even a minute of mobile telephony was cheaper than a minute of hiring a high school graduate. So by now, we're in a very different world. And it's not talk that's the scarcity, but our time. So the product hasn't changed to reflect that new reality, and that we want to organize our conversations in a different way in order to achieve efficiency around our time. However, kudos where it's due is that phone system has left behind a bunch of things like universal service, emergency lifeline, 911, and legal intercept, which are valuable and vital to how our society works, and need to be preserved at some level. And also left behind this huge ecosystem of the telecom industry, which has, let's face it, connected up billions of people. So the traditional telecom model has it spread far faster than the internet, and it must have done so for a reason. So that beautiful packaging of telephony and SMS and the economic incentives it provides has got billions of people connected. So hurrah for telcos.
Martin?
Yes.
Can I just a quick interruption here to mention the fact that there's another thing that's changed that maybe you're going to address in a minute, maybe you haven't, which is attention span and the whole attention economy. Because these days, when you get a phone call, a lot of people are very impatient with that. You did mention that, and the whole etiquette of am I disturbing you, and some people don't ask, and you have to tell them that you are, and so on. But there's also this problem of attention is such an incredibly rare thing these days.
Yes. It's a quote I heard yesterday was. Modern America is a nation where people pace back and forth in front of a microwave. And I suppose that works in two ways. Is you want to have if you're the caller, you're the initiator of some conversation. You potentially want to get to your outcome relatively quickly, and if you're the impact of the cost of having someone intrude in your space when you feel like you want to control your time very much feels greater now than maybe it used to. In a world where people had a more leisurely lifestyle and weren't context switching so much, maybe a phone call ringing in the middle of the evening was an exciting thing.
Right.
It was an up-tempo thing that, whereas if you're working on your laptop in the middle of the evening and you've just been having all kinds of conversations with all kinds of people simultaneously, and another one comes in, it doesn't have that same impact. So yes, I think the human context has changed enormously, and the product has not.
Right.
And there's a danger for people in the WebRTC world of unconsciously replicating many of the patterns of telephony. Just as Skype, for example, is very telephony-like. When you start to think about which browser tab should be ringing, maybe you haven't quite grasped yet that maybe need to be other patterns than interrupt and ring. So just roll forward to the present. Look at some of the issues. So that Telco World exists in competition with the over-the-top world. As we know, that has caused enormous corrosion to the telecom model. So there's the three horsemen of the telepocalypse: arbitrage, competition, and regulation. And as everyone knows, they're greatly hurting the traditional voice model. And the temptation for phone companies is to retreat to the secret nuclear bunker somewhere in Nebraska, which works for the short term, but is not a good long-term lifestyle. So what operators are doing is fitting in with what's been historically their winning pattern in communications, which is not to have the fastest network or to have the jazzy services, but to out-distribute the competition, which means having more network coverage, your service available in more places. So, for example, handsets available closer to the user in more retail stores, and that your services work in more places than everyone else's services. So an example of that would have been 10 years ago, Verizon, Sprint launching PCS Vision with lots of jazzy services. At the same time, Verizon using the same technology saying, "Can you hear me now?" And Verizon trouncing Sprint as a result. So the current instantiation of that is telcos going off-net and extending their voice messaging services off-net and creating a greater coverage footprint, but it's a cloud service coverage rather than traditional access coverage. So if you can't beat them, join them. That's what they're currently doing. So it's just giving rise to this hybrid world of the telco OTT. And it's okay as far as it goes. And the contentious assertion I've made here is that, however, the internet cannot and never will carry society's real-time communication needs. And there are some subtle mathematical reasons as to why the internet, as it's currently constructed, communication needs, not as it's currently deployed. It requires a major rethink in order to do that. And not going back to the basics as to what is it people want to do to communicate. So the question I think they need to address is how do they truly bring their voice products into the era of the cloud, if they want to stay in business at all doing this stuff. And by cloud, I don't just mean virtualized service delivery in some data center. I mean cloud as the fourth wave of industrial revolutions behind the coal and electricity and oil that we have, which is cheap information. So how do they bring voice into the area of cheap information is what that really means, rather than just trying to emulate two people being in the room together. So that's the telco story. If we look at the web story, it's in parallel. If we go back to the beginning, the whole web comes from a different mindset, and it also helps to explain its blind spots and things it doesn't see. So Steve Jobs set the scene. He says, what a computer is to me is it's the most remarkable tool that we've ever come up with. It's equivalent to a bicycle for our minds. So the assumptions were all about connecting of networking, were about data communications, and none of the assumptions come behind the telephone and telegraph were built into this world. So specifically, people with computing backgrounds see computers as amplifiers for effort and spreading ideas. So there's a crankshaft. The crankshaft is a lever, and that is the thing that makes our ideas have greater force in the world. And one of the most potent, so slide 44, the most potent ideas, or idea amplifiers, is the hyperlink. It is the transistor for an idea. It is the amplifier. And the critical thing was to give documents URLs. The ability to point was the critical innovation. So that gave rise to a very familiar world of documents and homepages, and then blogs is the first step towards the next phase of the web, with the social web. And all of that was built on hypertext. And that didn't really have much impact on the world of voice and messaging. However, the world moved on, and we started to give individual events URLs, individual pictures people have taken, individual little thoughts they've had, little comments, and that gave rise to a new metaphor, not documents but streams. And there's a very familiar world of Delicious and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, where we live today, and a whole new world of innovation was unleashed by reducing the granularity of the thing to which we were linking. But we were still linking to something that's relatively coarse-grained. And Tim O'Reilly came along, gave it a name, called it social web, Web 2.0, and it was an amplifier that increased our ability to relate. And here's, I think, is an important insight, slide 50. What I think in retrospect Web 2.0 was the rise of not hypertext but hypermessaging, which was we'd invented a new hypermedium to go into our cosmos of hypermedia by giving individual events and thoughts a URL. So we'd taken up our bicycle for the mind and used it to amplify something new, which is our thoughts. So going towards the present, for the web folks, there's kind of a Groundhog Day for the web, which is just from animated GIFs to JavaScript to Flash videos to HTML5 video, whatever. It's like there's been a cycle of embed new binary medium into document metaphor, and assume it works on the internet, because most things do, and everyone else will figure out how to make use of it, and then that's fine. Which has worked until now, but I think starts to come unstuck when we get to voice, because voice has a different structure to it. So the epitome of that today is WebRTC. And this is not to diss WebRTC, because I think it is a useful and potentially highly disruptive technology, which my expectation will receive it will receive a great deal of adoption and use. However, it's neither necessary nor sufficient to make voice into a true native of the web. Because the web is about linking, amplifying ideas, not just exchange of media. So I think the same question applies to the website, which is how do we truly bring voice into our integrated online experience rather than existing as a kind of parallel universe? So we find ourselves at the crossroads of these two worlds and ecosystems, and that's why it's confusing. There's a whole bunch of assumptions that are 100 years old from telcos and 30, 40 years old that come from the web, both of which are being challenged. Right, so let's pause one moment because I have to blow my nose. Excuse me a second.
That's an opportunity for me to make sure that everybody's ready with some good questions. This is fascinating stuff, and it's a little bit of a departure from what we usually talk about. Okay,
so this is away from the nuts and bolts of how to deliver streams of real-time audio. So how can we resolve that confusion, the collision? And simple insight is we don't think of web pages as being cloud text. We see it as hypertext. We understand the metaphor we're supposed to use. And Tim Berners-Lee conceived of the whole web as being a hypertext medium explicitly, how he described it. Whereas Ted Nelson, who came up with the idea of hypermedia, saw a much richer world of many types of hypermedia beyond hypertext. So why did we talk of cloud voice? Well, maybe we should be thinking about Hypervoice, and because cloud voice tends to focus on the technical delivery aspects, I feel, rather than the intrinsic amplification of ideas, which is what the web is really about. So that makes up with a way of linking that is native to voice and live or recorded voice, rather than to a document metaphor. So we have to transcend the limits of web voice as currently conceived and instead move to what I call Hypervoice, slide 60. And here's the bit to remember. So what is Hypervoice? It is anything that links what we say to what we do. It links speech to its context, and in particular to any digital objects or interactions we have around what we say. So just as like our grandparents might have had, or great-grandparents might have had 3 photographs of them taken during their lifetime, and my great-great-great-grandparents not at all, then and today it's ordinary to go around and have a dozen photographs of your life taken every day. 20 years ago, it was unimaginable we keep all the messages we sent. Google Mail comes along, we keep everything. Voice will also go through a similar transition, where not everything may be recorded, but everything will become recordable. There are many conversations that we will wish to remain permanently private and ephemeral, but there are also many that will by default be recorded, just like you can call a call center today, a contact center. There'll be others where you might want to start recording halfway through. So, well, let's say you're in a sales meeting, and you've got to the point where you and the customer agree that you want to do business. You might start to, in a sales call, then record the rest to hand off as a spec to your engineers or whoever's going to deliver the piece of business to say, this is what we've actually agreed. and to make it a high fidelity record of what's been agreed, unlike a text transcript of the ideas afterwards. So voice becomes just, particularly recorded voice, becomes just another object that needs to be managed and dealt with. And hypervoice links become bicycles for our memories. We become bionic memories with perfect recall. So what hypervoice lets us do is links things like the notes we've taken to the words we spoke at the time, or the slides we showed to the words we spoke at the time, or the screens we've shared, and the messages we sent, the web pages we browsed, or the documents we opened, or in an enterprise context, the customer records we viewed, or the sales opportunity we edited, or the trouble ticket we closed. So if you can imagine in your CRM system, why was this trouble ticket closed? Click. You can go back to listen to the internal call where people in the support team were discussing the trouble ticket and find out why it was closed. And it's the start of of what I call Web 3.0. So just as hypermessaging was Web 2.0, a new form of hypermedium is what triggers the next phase of the web. And hypervoice is what lets us transcend telephony. So, for example, you could imagine a CRM system assembling a list of trouble tickets that need to be talked about, dialing out to the relevant people for each trouble ticket, ordering them in the appropriate way so some people stay on the call. You talk about the trouble ticket, you resolve it, and there's an audio record that goes in the CRM system as to what was discussed, and any related digital objects that people touched. And if I do a search on that, my search can also be searching through your notes potentially, if they're sufficiently public or shared, to help index and provide the metadata around the voice. So it's the things people do naturally around talking become captured and become rich metadata that indexes the voice. So this is a new form of hyperlink. We are linking to individual voice gestures, and they get URLs, and therefore as pieces of spoken voice can become ideas that get amplified. However, it requires a temporal metaphor, and humans are really bad at thinking time-based. We're good at spatial. So, upgrade, ta-da! We're no longer just illusionists, we're actually full-blown magicians. Because we not only have bicycles for our minds, but we have time travel machines. And that's a new trick. And why would people in telcos care? Well, because they're selling this 20th century telephony thing, and they're going to have to compete against 21st century cloud rivals, which are going to have all the hyper properties. And it's when you put powerful amplifiers for ideas next to voice that it's very hard for a voice minute to compete against a value-added hyper voice minute in that model. So, two big feature changes. So firstly, user experience. Talk about the end of the hegemony of the caller. My guess is that in this hypervoice world, for example, today we arrange a conference call for a particular hour slot, and we have 8 things on the agenda, and we tend to make everyone have to sit through the whole conference call. That will change. We'll go to a more fluid environment where there's a list of maybe a list of virtual spaces which computer offers us, which are, Bob wants to resolve this problem, Mary has this customer service issue, etc. And you can step into those spaces. Mary will be there as well, or she can see that you stepped into it. There's no ringing going on, no interruptions, or you can step into several spaces simultaneously, and the first other person who turns up, you have a conversation with. And it's tied to its purposeful context, and those interactions may be much shorter. So it's kind of the death of the conference call, And we'll see new patterns of request and offer conversations arise that don't fit into the traditional way of thinking about making the phone ring. And how I think about the media behind audio will also change. So, for example, in a Hypervoice call, it makes sense to have both real-time communication, but also to locally record a pristine copy, which may go through audio makeup the same way as if you go on NPR and get interviewed today, there'll be machines that filter out the ums and the ers and the background noise. So the user experience will change. Also, the business model will change.
Martin,
yes.
Can I? Excuse me for interrupting. I just want to cover one little thing before you move to the business model, which is this: if you think about something like music, listening to a symphony, you need to listen to it. It takes maybe 20 minutes for a movement. There's no way to stop one note and listen to it and know what it means. If you translate that to what you're talking about, and again, fascinating stuff. How are you going to scan information? Example, if you had a transcription and the transcription was able to zoom away so you're seeing the points without someone actually going through manually doing it. I mean, I think that's kind of where you're going to go. But speak to us a little bit more detail on that, because this is a big problem, isn't it? I mean, you can't scan a long recording. You need indexes.
Right.
And who does that?
Absolutely.
And how?
Right, so the things people either do naturally around conversations, like take notes.
Mm-hmm.
You tie those notes, this is what the Harken product does, Symposia, is when people take notes in this conference calling product, they're tied to the moment at which the note was spoken. So anyone who comes along wants to join the meeting after it happens can go and click on any of the notes people took and shared publicly. And go and review that moment in the conversation. But there's also new behaviors like tagging the call as you go through it, or even tagging it as retrospectively. So you can tag it with important or to do, and there's a natural structure that narratives have. It's called the Freytag triangle. There's a little, and most movies have this structure, which is there's an initial big crescendo. Think of the opening of a James Bond movie. There's a big crescendo, dude, and then it dies down a bit. Then there's an interlude in the middle. There's another big crescendo, even bigger one later on, and a resolution, and it dies down again. And all those inflection points. So a decision being made over some contentious issue is an example of a crescendo. And those are the places in the conversation where people would naturally want to tag those moments. We made a decision, where we go from all the anxiety that comes with conflict and gets dissipated. So people will engage in new behaviors in order to create the metadata where there is value in doing it. So I was talking to someone yesterday who's an Oracle executive who has a team based around the world. It's basically impossible for him to have a conference call where all his team are on it simultaneously. The time zones don't work. So he needs people to be able to join the meeting after it happens and review the contents. And know where to look, without having to listen to the whole hour of audio. And therefore there is value in people on the meeting marking up the meeting as they go through it with Japan and Netherlands as the offices that need to pay attention to these moments. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, it absolutely does. We can move on to business model. I just wanted to comment, too, that Harken is interesting. We've had Harken on 2 or 3 times. It's one of the hardest things to show, as you well know. And I'm very pleased to learn that you're working with them. That's great, because Harken's an amazing product, and it's an amazing concept, and it fits right in with what you're saying. Thank you.
Yes. Good. Okay, so a business model, just as hypertext significantly transformed the market for text. Before everyone went out and bought books, and bought magazines, Google came along and the world became a lot freer. The same thing will happen in Hypervoice world. the money will be in taking friction out of everyday ordinary business processes done at industrial scale, making them more efficient, more effective, and more secure. And there's a whole world of complexity and detail behind that. But I think a good example of that kind of thing happening today is Fonolo. So what Fonolo do is let you navigate IVRs but using your smartphone. So they spider and scrape IVRs. You navigate them on your smartphone, then it dials out for you and then leaps through the IVR tree for you on your behalf. But what they're doing is a kind of Hypervoice deep linking. Yeah, it's a deep link into a Hypervoice conversation. And network technology. Networks are just large distributed supercomputers, and the way we tend to think of them using wrong metaphors. They are not pipes. They are never pipes. They don't have any of the properties of pipes. Stop piping them. What I think is going to happen is we're going to see, as we move everything to a cloud-like paradigm, we're going to go from the old fixed and mobile voice networks, which are very effective and efficient at what they do, but extremely inflexible. And the internet, which is both efficient and flexible, but is not very effective for real time. It is reliably unreliable and will remain so. And those are all built on what you might call monoservice networks, or single class of service networks. So the PSTN has a single class of service. Internet is typically single class of service. So we've kind of been building black and white networks. And what telcos are doing, and the enterprises, is we've got all these session border controllers and IMS and everything else to bleed off real-time traffic onto parallel infrastructures where people really can care about stuff that works rather than works-like stuff. And that's effective and flexible, but can be very inefficient. And the more and more different real-time applications we want to build, the more and more of these parallel monoservice overlays we find ourselves building. That's maybe not necessarily the way we want to go ultimately. So my belief, and there's a whole day's worth of literature behind this, not just hours, is we will ultimately move to polyservice networks. But they will work very differently to the way that people imagine quality of service works today. I'm working with some clever mathematicians in the UK that have fundamentally new ways of thinking about how to manage flows on networks. So we'll eventually crack the equivalent of Kodachrome, which is how to give every flow on the network exactly the quality it needs and no more and no less, and use networks as trading spaces between all the flows. But it's that stuff that's just emerged out of the lab, and that's where we will go, because we require all three properties of effective, flexible, and efficient in future. The idea that you can over-provision your way out of all problems is not true. It is demonstrably false. I have data to prove it. The nature of the internet is not the way you think it works. It is unstable at all and every scales. Closing thoughts. Really interesting book, useful book I found to help frame this whole problem domain is Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital by Perez. There's these waves of innovation which transform society. So 1770, the first one began with railways and steam and coal and iron. We're in the fourth one, right in the middle of IT and telecoms. And they all have, on slide 86, the same structure. So there's about a 70-year period where we figure out the technology and just get it deployed into the world. The transistor was invented in the 1940s. We're about at the end of that period today. And we work out the purposes for which it is fit. And the PC is a good example of this. We deploy the PC and we find all kinds of new ways of using it. And then, electricity revolution, a farm would go out and buy one motor and have all kinds of adapters to use it for different purposes. Then there's a turning point where there's a financial bubble, a collapse, a lot of social upheaval, and then the whole of society starts to reorganize itself around the assumption that this stuff is just there. and the technology becomes invisible and modular and just goes into the background. So like your toothbrush has a motor in it, and you don't think about it. And Apple are the masters of this, of making the technology invisible and disappearing into the background. So we're at that turning point. So we're going from voice as a as like the PC or electric farm motor as a network service, to voice just being an innate online experience, just like the toothbrush motor is. But that requires thinking about voice in a different way, which is innate to the nature of that world. So just as it was hard for Henry Ford to envisage the strip mall as the consequence of the automobile becoming pervasive. It's very hard when we've grown up in a telephony world to conceive of what a hypervoice world ought to look like. So what do I think comes out of this collision? My guess is that we have, excuse me, I'm running out of voice. We have packaged cloud services where this is innate to the nature of the problem that networks have a role in containing the failure modes of applications, and that we will package together services and applications in all kinds of interesting new ways as packaged cloud services. And in contrast to that, I think we'll have also an emerging new chaotic space for trialing new success nodes, which is even more wild and crazy than the current internet. So if you think of how cognitive radios and mesh networks work, and all kinds of new collaborative and edge-based protocols, we'll experiment with all kinds of new stuff, and well, Libreville. We will continue to have a tension between a very controlled environment and a very open experimental one. So back to the present, people like to think about what does this all mean for us today. It's worth noting that what telcos tend to focus on is things like universal service funds and carrier compensation. Basically, they want to know how am I going to be regulated. But if you look back at what happens to the railroads, the same questions are being asked, and the regulator went out of business, and the railroads didn't, because all of those problems got transcended. The roads came along, and we see the internet plus the cloud plus cognitive radios and community networks and all kinds of other new stuff. There are roads, and the problems that the regulator was invented to solve, like the FCC or the Federal Radio Commission was invented to solve radio safety after the Titanic disaster 100 years ago. They're still in the business of perpetuating the problems that they were invented to solve. That they will have the same fate. Focus on the customer, not the regulator. What the telcos need to do. Get a grip of this hypervoice future. There's more to it than just voice. Get cloudy for service delivery because you need the flexibility to do that. The future is unknowable. The more flexibility you have, the better you are. For telcos, don't get into the services game. Import inventive services. Don't invent them yourself. But when you do get them right, export them off net. So there you are. That was my keynote.
Excellent, and I hope there are some interesting questions, but maybe you answered all of them already. Anyone? I'm watching IRC. Go ahead. Anybody's got a question? They're all afraid to speak. We rarely have such erudite company as guests. They're usually CEOs of huge companies. We have one question, where's my pizza? But I don't think Martin can help me with that one. Okay, well, we can only wait so long, folks. If you have a question.
Okay, Brian stepping in.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
I have a question.
Well, wait a minute. Before Brian, go ahead, Brian.
No, it's okay. I'll defer. Go ahead.
No, that's well. Okay, let's not argue about this.
Yeah, network collision. Go ahead, Andy, and Brian, stand by.
Illustrating the point, really, I guess.
Yeah.
I I look at this a slightly different way. You say that the internet is fundamentally unsuited for real-time voice communication and the sort of services you're talking about. Well, let me finish my point a moment. My background is military software, and I've been in it for far too long, so we're going back some 30 years now. And when you were doing real-time work, which is very much all that was required of us at the time, everything was real-time, it was quite hard to do back then. But everything else around the whole system changed. And now, achieving real-time in terms of the way that we used to test it is really simple. You don't need a real-time operating system. You don't need to worry about keeper lives, watchdogs, none of those. You really don't need to worry about them anymore, because the systems you're using have evolved to a state which is way beyond what you actually need. And I'd be pretty sure that the internet will do the same thing. So I'm a little undecided here as to where this data that you say you've got that says that everything is inherently unstable leaves us with this.
Right. Okay. So my claim is the internet is unsuitable for carrying society's real-time communication needs, which is subtly different from it being. It's not the same as it's not capable of doing real-time, but the thing the internet is good at is enabling experimentation with new success modes of applications. The thing it's very poor at is containing the failure modes. And so give you some examples of what goes wrong on the internet. So there's multiple problems with TCP/IP. TCP breaks the first rule of control theory. Is that it tries to create control loops that are trying to respond to phenomena that are happening faster than the control loop can operate. And so contention in the network. Furthermore, TCP works to deliberately saturate the network. So it keeps increasing the speed of transmission until you get loss. That makes networks unstable. They have, it's well known they have congestion collapse. But that congestion collapse happens at every scale. So there are little spikes of loss and delay, basically little congestion collapses happening at every scale. And because of the choice of what's called work-conserving queues, is that they agglomerate. It's like a condensation effect, like hailstones. So we see these spikes of loss and delay, and the corresponding phenomenon of buffer bloat is seeing very, very, very high spikes of loss and delay. And what we're trying to do, what you see people respond to that, is trying to shorten the control loops by putting in, there's IETF connects and various other technologies to try to get the signal back to the sender saying you're overloading the system. Please stop doing it. With shorter and shorter control loops. However, what this is doing is taking the bigger spikes and trying to turn them into lots of smaller spikes. And what that does is it sets up a high-speed oscillation in loss and delay. So even if the absolute amounts are relatively low, so there's a jitter has two parts to it. One of which is the absolute amount, and the other one which is the rate at which loss and delay change. And TCP can only work if the conditions on the network in the future are related to the conditions in the past. And as you set up this non-stationarity, this high-speed oscillation, that relationship breaks down. And the ceiling at which congestion collapse occurs gets lower and lower and lower. So there's a kind of statistical thermal noise that's built into the internet, which is a byproduct of TCP/IP breaking the first rule of control theory. And using UDP or having control loops built into codecs doesn't change the situation. You're still trying to you're still trying to break control theory, and what you have to recognize is that networks are that all comes from a mental model of networks as being machines that are in the business of pushing packets. But what networks really are is trading spaces for loss and delay. And the internet doesn't understand or respect that. So because it spreads out all those trades and makes bad trades and inappropriate trades all down the path, it will always be unstable, and it will always have. And the more you try to de-spike the spikes of loss and delay, which are the ones which cause real-time services to fail, the more you try to create high-speed oscillation and non-stationarity in the whole thing. So I know many of the people who came up with all this stuff originally, and they regard the end-to-end principle and TCP/IP as being brilliant. And I'm saying no, it's not actually. It's a horrible hack, and it's been great for allowing us to decouple all flow control and mission control from the network and experiment with new stuff. But it comes at a price. It is not free. And the price is that you now have a new form of unpleasant and uncontained failure mode, which is not going to go away.
Okay, that makes some sense. I'm obviously going to have to investigate this somewhat more.
I'm looking at IRC here, Recon Wireless. There was a slide that mentioned business models. Is the future Martin predicts, an integration of note-taking and voice and attaching that to the network or cloud, one-note audio sync on steroids? Interesting expression.
Kind of. If you think of us going from a static document paradigm to a completely fluid dynamic paradigm, so we've talked about the real-time web. It's about moving from documents to activity streams. So Facebook is about creating activity stream. Twitter is about creating activity stream. And it's how do we tie all the things we say and do to our activity stream, rather than in the case of voice, saying stuff and throwing it away as if what we said has no value. Much of what we say may have little value in retrospect, but short parts of it really, really do, and particularly in a business context. So what we have to do is work out how do we take all those things and relate them together and then integrate them into our personal activity streams, which also suggests to me that the idea of the browser is very limiting. We need to move beyond thinking about browsers. That's another thought for another day.
Okay, Brian, you still with us?
Yes, I am. Well, look, I got to say, Martin, it was such a great pleasure to see you lay out so professionally so many of the thoughts that I've been, having over the years in parallel and attempting to implement. And you've come along at just the right time. I think you're spreading the gospel.
Yep, thank you.
Just as the call started, I sent an email to VUC Group with a couple of links to the last time I had a contact with the VUC was about a year ago, when we had an example of verbal voice. That's my prototyping environment, running in Google Gadgets. And so that conference is still available. If you click on the links, it'll come up in a current gadget, a bit more advanced. Plus, we have an interactive web page which embeds the playlist as well in a context that you can edit and so on. So I'd love you to take a look at that. And anyone else on the call, we're just coming to the point where we're looking for partners. And I'd love to take you through what we're doing in a bit more detail. But it does answer or point the way in many, many respects to exactly what Martin is suggesting.
Yeah, there's definitely a synergy here. I take it you two don't know each other, or have never?
No, we do.
Oh, okay. Well,
we
then...
just met earlier this week. I had
okay.
a short call and a really quick demo. So we're going to follow up, I'm sure. And I'd love to follow up with anyone else on the call and perhaps come back. What occurs to me is, as I was listening to your presentation, Martin, I had trouble catching up with the slides. I had to go 3 different pages before I found the PDF version of the slides.
Well, that's because I was out of sync half the time, and I'm sorry for that. But the slides are available, so everybody can download those.
I'm sure they were there. I just couldn't find them.
Okay.
So I went to the streaming versions because I was on the bridge via Skype, and when I clicked play, it started the whole thing again way behind. But eventually I found the PDF and I was able to follow along. But what I'd like to do is a verbal version of this with the slides linked in to the presentation at convenient points, and show it back to you.
It's an interesting idea. You would just need the recording?
Yeah.
Which will be available on the site. Which will be available on the site early. Well, actually, late today, when I wake up tomorrow morning.
Yes, I may need to use that, but I did also take up your invitation to last time to record on verbal. So I conferenced in my verbal system through my Skype connection. So I don't know what kind of quality it will be. If it's not so good, I can copy from the podcast.
Yeah, we'll have a good one. We may want to be able to let Martin go. I don't know what his obligations are time-wise. Does anyone else have any questions before we go any further? Now's the time to speak. It's a great opportunity this was really a fascinating presentation, and I'm glad I downloaded the presentation because, as I was saying, I had a little trouble following it, getting the things in sync, and so now I'm going to be able to go through it at my leisure. And that's good news if Verbal is going to redo it. Go ahead. Somebody's got some questions?
I may have one. I'm assembling it as we go along here. Is there how is this all being received by large corporate concerns? I guess that would be the big question.
Right. So yesterday I gave a private workshop supported by Telefonica with Oracle, demonstrating their integration with Harkin's product, the Oracle Social Network integrated. So the initial reception appears to be very positive, and there's clear value in voice between collaboration and communication products.
It seems to me that we see a pattern in so many industries that things go from idea to business and from business to an industry, and at every step of the way they become more intransigent and less able to evolve or adapt, and eventually they get left behind. Yeah. So the question is, does this spawn an entirely new industry, or does it cause the existing space to shed a great many players in its wake?
I think more the I think both, isn't it? It spawns a new industry, and it causes a lot of existing players to go out of business.
This is kind of a funny time, isn't it? Because the non-innovational stuff like machine-to-print money, SMS, which is being preempted by so many other services now, so they're dying on that one. Lots of rumblings about HD voice on cells, but not a lot being done. I mean, there's a million things happening. Things are going. It's a little chaotic.
And the trouble seems to be that a lot of the hype and the action in the space is relevant to things that don't involve the carriers necessarily. Definitely. You know, there's a lot of buzz about apps and such like, but except for as gatekeepers, the carriers aren't directly involved in a lot of that.
Right, and it's interesting that you mentioned Oracle, Martin, because Oracle is a kind of a company that probably could suddenly make a big noise and have a bunch of people lift their heads and look.
Yes, yeah, certainly. Yeah. This was also demonstrated at Oracle Open World. So, and I'm in the process of setting up. It's not been sort of formally launched and announced to the world, but Hypervoice.org as a community platform for those who are interested in Hypervoice to gather around. So, if anyone has any thoughts, comments, suggestions on firstly how to expand the circle of who knows? Secondly, to have a platform to engage, who cares? And thirdly, what we might do for those who can, then do get in touch. So mail@martingeddes.com, drop me a note.
Okay. Anyone else didn't get to ask their question? Trying to put that Hypervoice.
Well, just one little follow-up question, Martin, while I have you. For me to be able to link to individual slides, I'm not sure if I'll be able to do that with the PDF file. Do you have a source of the slides as, you know,
Yep,
individual files or a page?
I can send you the originals.
All right.
Okay, I think we're going to end the video because it doesn't serve much of a purpose now. I tried to do what I could. I hope